Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for another hour of podcasting greatness here on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and with video on YouTube. And I believe we are now on iHeartRadio and Spotify. So that's happy news for the expansion of my podcast here. And I'll just say right at the top of the show, if I would very, very much like to grow this show and my channel. So please do, if you are enjoying my channel and my shows, please do like, share, spread the good word out there amongst your social contacts, because I think that there's a lot here of good stuff to share. And on that note, this week we are doing something really different. I mean, we're really going into something I have never done a show about. Yet, my entire life, I have been absolutely fascinated by the topic of vampires. And so when the opportunity presented itself for me to do a podcast episode about this subject, I jumped at it. And I am welcoming here today AP Sylvia. Now, welcome to the show, AP.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. Now, you've written a book called Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, which goes into, our current ideas about vampires, and you sort of break it down trait by trait and show where those things came from and how they relate to modern thinking and ancient thinking. And I really want to get a hold of this book, but I am fascinated by the way you've done it, because I thought to myself, as fascinating as a topic that this has been my whole life. I mean, I've really done some deep dives as a teenager on what vampire lore is and all of that, and I'm not going to try to throw that around in the show here. I just because I think I've forgotten 90% of it, but I think that it's just such a fascinating topic to me, and it always has been. How has this been a topic of interest for you?
Well, I've sort of always been interested in kind of supernatural beliefs and that kind of thing. Even a while ago, I was going through some old books I had from when I was a kid, and I ran across a book about ghosts that I had gotten as a kind of a small boy. So I've always sort of been interested in this kind of stuff. But what really kind of got me down this particular path with vampires, it goes back a few years ago. It was when I was in New York City in Times Square, and walking around there. We ran across a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum. I'm not sure. Have you ever been to one of those?
I have, because there was one in Hollywood.
Yes, I've been to that one as well. Yes.
Yeah, because I lived and worked in Hollywood for 17 years, so we would walk by that sometimes, and then I finally dared to go in there one day. It's kind of a weird place.
I love those places. They're great. They're right up my alley. So went to the one. I was in Times Square and kind of checking out all the different sort of objects and things they have, strange artifacts and whatnot. And one of the things that they had was behind glass. It was this old wooden box, and it had like a cross in it and these vials of different things. And it was like a pistol and silver bullet mold and stuff. And it was labeled as a 19th century vampire killing kit.
Really?
Yes.
Because you see that in the old cult classic, the Hammer films and the old horror movies. You see that kit being carried around by the vampire hunters.
Yeah, they've got all their stuff. They open it up, they've got all their stuff inside ready to go. So they had they have this thing at Ripley's, and it's the label kind of says like, oh, this was sold to people who were traveling to Eastern Europe, in the 19th century. And I thought it was the coolest thing. I thought it looked so neat.
Yeah.
So I, sometime later, I'm back home, and my mind kind of wanders back to that thing. I'm like, what's the story with that thing? I got to find out more about these kits. What was going on? So I took to the internet, did some Googling, and I wound up finding that there's actually a bit of controversy or disagreement around these kits. So Ripley's owns a number of them, and they have them in various their various museums, and they maintain that they're authentic. But there are some other kits around. There are some in other museums. And some have argued that the kits actually don't date to the 1800s. The argument is that that people in the 20th century took period objects and then assembled them together to make a kit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
yeah,
so
it would be harder to tell with a situation like that.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the arguments for that was that one person was asserting like, well, these kits they represent sort of the pop culture view of vampires, like the Hammer movies and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
They don't reflect actual folklore, and sort of that that statement kind of sort of got me on a deeper track of like, well, what did people believe about vampires?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What was the folkloric thinking versus the pop culture thinking? And I knew that there were differences just from kind of my general interest, and I'd watched some documentaries about it and stuff like that. But I kind of wanted to really find out. I'm like, I really want a breakdown of this stuff. So I started sort of just on the internet or whatever, kind of searching around, and I couldn't quite find anything that gave me the information in the way that I wanted it, sort of trait by trait, going into each one, looking for sort of the origins and that kind of thing. No one seemed to have all of that. And so I started researching these different things, and I sort of just ended up writing the book that I wanted to read.
Right, exactly. I'll tell you, I mean, just from the description of your book and the way we've been talking already, I am quite positive that would be the book I would write if I was going to write a nonfiction book about vampires. Right. I would probably go in that direction, because I have had the exact same questions. What is up with the holy water? What's up with the cross? What's up with the garlic? And I have answers for some of those questions in the ancient lore and legends that I went and looked at. But I don't know if I found the definitive answers. I found a answer, and it appeared to be satisfactory to me at the time. But I don't know if what I'm sitting on is the right data or not. I don't sit around thinking about this all the time, but I just find it to be so damn interesting, because it's really a way of tracing how they develop, the development.
Sure, the evolution of them.
Evolution, there's the word I was looking for, but I kept thinking EP. Anyway, yeah, the evolution of our folklore. Because it's kind of a direct, you can draw a direct line and take it all the way to the present and see how it was screwed around with over time and why and what happened. And I just find this stuff endlessly fascinating, in the same way I find wordplay interesting, the way words have evolved and the meanings change because of cultural factors and things like that, that the cultural factors change and pass, but the word stays the same, or stays with that same new meaning, and we lose the idea of why it ever changed, Anyway, I'm wondering, what did you find?
Well, I found a lot. There was a lot there. There was a lot to kind of sift through. Certainly a lot of surprises, things that I wasn't necessarily expecting to find. Some things that confirmed things that we do consider to be vampiric today. And the book took quite a while it took me a couple of years, I think, to write the thing.
I was going to ask, how much research was this? Was this a major activity for you, or a hobby kind of activity? How did this work?
I did it in my spare time, to be honest with you. It was kind of a hobby and just sort of an interest. And I just sort of started diving into things. My approach to it was that I tried to go back sort of as far as I could and tried to read older sources, period sources, pre-20th century, if I could. Because one of the things I kind of found sort of early on in the process was that I would read maybe a summary of an old tale, like that a modern person had written, say on the internet or an article or wherever. This happened to me, and I would read it and I'd say, these things that we considered to be, sort of traits of a vampire. I guess they were in these old stories. And then if I went back and read the original tale, suddenly a lot of these things weren't there anymore. And so
Mm.
I think what happens is that some writers, knowingly or not, they let their preconceived notions about vampires kind of inject things or interpret things a certain way, and it winds up sort of changing the story. So you really
Mm-hmm.
want to, and especially, when you think about it, the vampire has there's sort of such strong imagery we have for a vampire right now in terms of what you expect to see. But you really need to sort of move away from that stuff. So I tried to go back when I could. I did use some 20th century sources, but I tried to kind of go towards more like scholarly things and things like that when possible,
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of be judicious about what you're picking. But I mean, I wound up having around like 90 some odd sources or something like that in my bibliography for this thing.
So this
So
was an honest effort at a real look at where this lore comes from, and it's more than just the sort of development of vampires in the movies or something. You're taking this way back. You're going all the way back.
yes, I was trying to look at sort of the folklore and the legends and the true beliefs that people had, and sort of compare that to what we think of vampires today in movies and TV shows and books and things like that,
Right.
and sort of see where those differences are, and sort of deconstruct our modern vampire, and then sort of reveal the folkloric vampire behind it.
So should we go right to the spoiler, or should we? Well, what I'm curious about, of course, is okay. So you've done this research now. You've got this, all this knowledge. So here we have the modern vampire, and if we talk modern vampire, are we talking, 20th, 21st century, or are we saying from Dracula forward, or what are we? What defines for you the modern take on the vampire?
Well, I in the book, in terms of coming up with the traits, I sort of thought about present day, kind of what you think of for a vampire, especially for like Halloween imagery or something
Okay.
like that. Like when
Okay.
Halloween rolls around and there's some cartoon vampires, on a sign or advertising or in a show or something like that. There's a very sort of definitive kind of look and kind of what they do and that kind of thing. So I sort of went with the baseline there. But in the book, I kind of explore how we have the folkloric vampires, but I also talk about 19th century literature, which made a number of significant changes to sort of how what people perceive to be a vampire, how it operated. Obviously, late 1800s, Bram Stoker, right, comes out with Dracula,
Right.
which I don't think you can overstate Stoker's impact on
Right.
the fictional vampire. I mean, his shadow looms quite large. I mean, everyone knows Count Dracula, right?
And when you talk about Halloween imagery, that's the imagery that's used.
That's it. It's Count Dracula, right?
I mean, they got the nice clothes. Sometimes he's even wearing a little metal.
Yeah.
And he's always got the hair brushed back, and and then the oversized canines.
Got the big canines. You'll see the vampire. They have the cape, and they might hold it up kind of like bat wings.
Yep.
They kind of loom out and stuff like that.
That's right.
But I mean, it's interesting to think. Before Stoker came out with Dracula, like no one knew who Dracula was. Like, it wasn't a thing, right?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. That's actually what I'm wondering, because of course we have this idea that it goes back to Vlad the Impaler. I want to ask, before we get into that history, and we're definitely going to in just a minute, but I wanted to ask, it seems that all of the films, mainline books and stuff that were written around the subject of vampires, or using vampires as the theme, uses the Dracula model, or very tiny variations of the Dracula model. Is that in itself, do you think that's a factual statement?
I mean, I think, Dracula, I think, impacts any whenever someone's coming up with sort of a vampire, fiction of any kind, TV or something like that, Dracula's in your mind. He's gonna be there in some fashion. I think, especially these days, people like to take the vampire in new directions.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes there's like a sci-fi aspect to it, right? So vampirism is caused by like a virus or something like that.
Oh,
right?
There is that, and yet the characteristics of the vampires remain
to a
Fangs,
certain extent,
blood.
right. But like the core behind it, like, oh, well, it's a virus now, not, so people are taking it and it grows and adapts and it changes over time.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's, if you're doing like a vampire, I think like if you're going to do like a vampire show or something like that, and you're going to deviate from some of those things, usually you kind of have to explain why. You kind of have to like toss it. Well, I thought vampires did. No, they don't. Da, da, da.
Right.
But you still have to like kind of like, you have to sort of point it out almost, because audiences have certain expectations, right? So if you're producing something, you need to sort of take that into account.
Right. Well, of course. And I think we're talking of, like, for example, an example is what Guillermo del Toro did with that TV show they did on FX a couple of years ago. It was based on a book, and of course, the name is escaping me right now. But it was
The Strain. Was that what it was?
The Strain. That's right. And it was vampirism as a virus, and
Yes.
and they ended up having these things, these tentacles shoot out of their mouth and stuff. But it was that this was what was the old vampire legends were all based on. This was the reality, sort of how it was put forward, and then vampires take over New York City and then the world. Which you would think they would do pretty quickly if they actually had those kind of powers. I mean, what would stop them?
Where they been?
Yeah, exactly. So you see variations like that. I grew up on Dracula with Frank Langella and Lost Boys. They Thirst by Robert McCammon. Stephen King's Salem's Lot. This was the stuff that I grew up on. I was literally reading Salem's Lot when I was like 11 years old, and I just couldn't. It's my favorite Stephen King book because I love vampires so much. So I was very much raised on that sort of standard model, I guess you could say. And I appreciated what Del Toro and the Strain did with making it into a virus. I went, now that's a nice variation. I like seeing that. I like seeing some creativity with that. How far back is Dracula the seminal point of that way of thinking about vampires then?
I mean, I think just Dracula, I mean, the novel was sort of a culmination, I think, of a trend in the 19th century of changing kind of what a vampire was. And we can.
So there were other works in the 19th century about vampires.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Oh, pray tell.
Absolutely.
I mean, all we really know about is Dracula. So your average Joe, Dracula.
Right.
What else was there?
He's a household name, right? So I guess maybe I'll kind of do sort of a brief overview of sort of the evolution, right? So
yeah,
when you look back to the folkloric vampire, these the folkloric vampire was a scary thing that was off. It was these were real events that happened where people thought, oh my goodness, this person who was in our community who passed away is now causing illness and death in living people. Right. So this might have been a friend or a loved one or something like that. That suspicion falls on them that they are a vampire. Right. And you have legends surrounding this, but then you actually also have like historical accounts where people believe this was happening and took action because of it.
Same as witches.
Pardon me?
Same as witches. Witches were
absolutely
real.
Yes.
It was
absolutely.
It was not some hyperbole. She's a witch. That means she practices black magic. She's literally in league with Satan. We got to go burn her. It's the only thing we can do.
It's
like
people
that.
Believe that there was a supernatural force having a real effect on their lives.
Right. Yeah.
So in the 19th century, there's a few different works of literature that I talk about in the book that really had an impact on changing things. One of them, which was it was written in, I believe it was 1819, by a guy named it was Dr. Polidori, and he wrote this novella called The Vampire. And in this book, the vampire's name is Lord Ruthven, and he's a nobleman, and he's kind of this suave, mysterious fellow who this young man kind of befriends him, and they kind of travel around Europe a bit, and he realizes that this guy has, this sort of detrimental effect on people around him and stuff like that. And ultimately, Lord Ruthven is a vampire, right? So this one's important, and I also mentioned Polidori. It was the novella was often attributed to Lord Byron, famous poet.
Oh, that's where Byron comes into that, because that always sort of sounded a little weird to me that he was writing about vampires.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, so he didn't write it. His personal physician wrote it.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and so some people wonder. Apparently, Polidori and Byron didn't get along very well. So some people think that Polidori kind of modeled the Lord Ruthven after Byron.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I was wondering where that look came from. This was the first of what would be a new look for vampires in terms of this is
yes, this is kind of changing direction here with vampires.
Because prior to this, and we'll get into details about it, but prior to this, they were kind of guttural, like undead, or there were a lot of different versions of it. Yeah, they weren't things you'd be chilling with or hanging out with.
No, you wouldn't really be hanging out with them all that much. There were, you were scared of them, and people kind of, as a vampire, don't hang out with them.
Right.
But yeah,
but this was a sort of infiltration into society.
That's exactly it. So it changes, right? So now the vampire is moving around in high society, right? You're inviting him to dinner, right? And he's charming people and stuff like that.
Right.
And I think, it speaks to the audience and the culture at the time, right? So with sort of the folkloric vampires, they were being used as a scapegoat to explain why people were getting sick, illness, famine, bad weather, stuff like that. There was a purpose to it, right? It was a way for people to kind of focus their fears and apprehensions on something and then take action against that thing. Right.
So if there weren't any witches in the village to burn, then then maybe a vampire was around.
So, that's an interesting point you make, and I actually talk a bit about that in my book, and I compare sort of witches and vampires because there's actually quite a bit of overlap between them. And I think you touch on something that is sort of a very kind of sad and troubling aspect to it all. With these kinds of things, the people in the community, they're scared, they're looking for an answer. If suspicion fell on a dead person, it's sort of this sort of probably emotional, gut-wrenching thing. It's very sad. But the victim is already dead, right? The vampire is already, it's a dead person already. Unfortunately, if suspicion goes in the direction it falls on a live person, well, now you have executions and things like that. So it's very sad. It's very sad when you look at those kinds of things.
Right. Well, in that sense, I mean, from that proportion, it's same as witch hunts in terms of purpose, reasoning, motivation, and ultimately outcome. And every one of them is a tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate when you look at these old tales, and you can see that people through misunderstanding and fear, or whatever maybe selfish intentions they had,
right.
These kinds of things happened, whether you're looking at the vampires or sort of the historical witch accounts or something like that, or you're looking at the Salem witch trials and stuff like that.
Right.
So anyway, so we're talking about sort of the vampire with Polidori. So that's kind of a big work that kind of changes things. Another one from the 1840s, there was a Penny Dreadful called Varney the Vampire.
Yes.
And this one was it ran for quite a while. It wound up being put together into a novel that was like 800 pages or something like that. It was just really big, because the Penny Dreadfuls, they were churning them out like constantly, so it winds up being this giant thing. But anyway, that introduced some different things as well, to sort of these vampire traits. And then there's some other works as well, Carmilla and such.
Was there anything unique in Varney that added to the current mystique
So
or imagery?
sure. So let's kind of talk about some traits maybe.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe I'll ask you what would you say is probably in our modern thinking the most defining trait of a vampire? Like the one thing you can show on screen that says, "Oh, that person's a vampire."
They're drinking blood.
I wouldn't. I'd say even more than that. I'd
Well,
say
the
what
sharp
else?
teeth.
The
The
teeth,
teeth.
right? The
Yeah.
fangs,
Yeah.
right? Like that's it. Like if someone turns to the camera and they smile and you see those canines, right? Like, oh, it's a vampire,
Yep.
right? That's literally all you need,
That is true.
right?
Yes.
Right. So that to me, I think, is probably one of the most defining kind of visual cues that you can do for a vampire, I would say. Um, so one of the kind of shocking things I found when I looked at the folklore was that fangs aren't in it. The folkloric vampire didn't have fangs.
Oh, okay. They were
Yeah.
regular dead people.
They were regular dead people. They
Okay.
didn't
They
they
didn't get
didn't
the.
have it's no that like fangs long like canines are never mentioned in any of the folkloric accounts.
Okay. So, and would we be safe in saying, in terms of folkloric accounts, the pre-1800s?
Actually, no.
How far back do we
There's
go when we talk about that?
well, actually, there were a number of there were vampire incidents that happened in the 1800s.
Mm.
People believing in vampires in the 1800s.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So historical accounts, let's say.
All right.
So there's a time when these things kind of they coexist, sort of the fictional and the folkloric, and I even talk about like one incident in the 2000s that people believe that there was a vampire. It got a little bit of press.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess there's always going to be some people who are true believers.
Right. Well, I mean, you think about it. These were part of the culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're sort of these, they're these supernatural beliefs that went through generations and stuff like that. And so, like one account that I mentioned, the book that was post 2000 was in like a very rural village, like in Romania. So it's it's an interesting thing. But the folkloric accounts, I mean, so I talk about some incidents from the 1800s, 1700s was a lot of sort of impactful events happen. But the legends and stuff like that. One tale I talk about was written about in the 12th century.
Okay.
Right. So these things go back a long time.
What is, and we're going to get back to the traits thing. I haven't forgotten about that, but I wanted to ask, I was going to ask earlier when we were walking down the path here, how far back does this go?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Study. Yeah. As far as your studies.
So how
earliest
how
account.
Far. And so that then gets into the question of, well, how do you define what a vampire is?
Okay.
So, like, if you read about these things, there are some folks that would take it all the way back to biblical times with Lilith. If you're familiar with the story of Lilith, where she
a little bit. What's the summary?
Basically, she was like the first wife of Adam, and she she refused to be submissive to him, and so she took off, and then Eve is made, and then Lilith kind of becomes this this monster, this like demonic thing.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that's kind of that. So some people would take it to that kind of
the way back to the beginning.
All the way back. They're going all the way back.
But in terms of real world verifiable stories that you go, okay, this is the earliest written account or verbal account that was recorded at some point? Like what? How do we? How far
I,
back does it go that way?
I would say probably that 12th century for a lot of
Okay.
my research was
Okay.
that was probably pretty far back for some of the documented stuff I found. I kind of ran across in my sort of trail of research. I want to say I think there might be a reference or two older than that. And there could be stuff older kind of floating around out there too. I don't think they came into being all of a sudden. You know what I mean? I
Mm-hmm.
think these things were around for all I know, as long as people have been wondering about the nature of death and stuff like that.
Sure.
So it's really hard to say, but I want to say that I think for my book, I want to say that might be one of the older tales one of the oldest tales in there, I want to say.
All right.
Um,
And the thing about these, of course, is when we're tracing real history and the real literature of this stuff or the real folklore with this stuff, then of course it's going to, be this messy spaghetti, strings of influences and changes and authors introducing new ideas with the 1800s and stuff. And so it mixes and matches up with other threads that are also mythic monsters or mythic legends, zombies, mummies, you know, werewolves. I mean, these all have
sure.
their own history trail, and it does mix up with some of this sometimes. I think the zombie concept mixes up with the vampire trail in some places with ideas of people getting buried alive and coming back and stuff like that. But
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays we like to fit all that kind of different movie monsters and stuff into different boxes.
yeah,
Like this is what a werewolf is,
right.
and this is what a vampire is,
That's
right?
right. That's
And
right.
that sort of this is what a witch is,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
She's got a broom in her hat, and she's got the cauldron, and that's what a witch is. Um, but when you look at these beliefs, these legends, and the beliefs around the supernatural, like they coexist and they commingle and they influence each other, and that's something I found with the vampire lore, and that's something I talk about in my book. My last chapter is about like witches and werewolves and the kind of the interplay between all of the vampires and witches and werewolves, and kind of how these beliefs overlap with each other and influence each other and stuff like that.
Right.
So it's hard to sort of make definitive statements with supernatural beliefs because they can differ from place to place. They grow and change and evolve. So what might be true for one place is not necessarily true for somewhere else in their belief system.
Right. Right. Well, okay, how did you go about then? And maybe we should have led with this, but how did you go about determining for yourself, what you would define as the characteristics you were looking for as to, okay, this is what we're going to call a vampire and this is what I'm looking for?
Sure. So I came up with sort of three criteria
Mhm.
for sort of determining this is what I'm going to deem to be a vampire for the context of my book. Because you can get into there's a lot of different supernatural beliefs out there with like, well, this is a monster that drinks blood, so that's that's a vampire, right?
Mhm.
And for me, I felt like if you cast the net too wide, you you sort of obscure sort of the psychological roots of this thing. Um,
Okay.
so what I went with is the first criteria is that the vampire is the reanimated corpse of a once living person,
Mhm.
right? So and this is an important distinction. The vampire used to be a normal real person at one point who passed away and became a vampire. So I'm kind of discounting any sort of like non-human entities that never were human to begin
Mm.
with, right? Like a monster or a demon or something like that,
Mhm.
or a human that never died but does magic
Mm.
or those sorts of things, because that can bleed in. There's stories of witches who drink blood, right?
Mhm.
um I mentioned one in my book in that last chapter where it was a belief that there was this type of witch, and it would drink blood at night.
Mhm.
But to me, well, that person, that's magic. They weren't dead. So I feel that that's kind of obscuring it, right? Or some kind of, non-human creature. I talk about like some not, some non-human creatures when I explain some of this in my book. So that's criteria one.
Mhm.
Criteria two is that they are harming the living in some way, right? So I'm broadening it out beyond just the blood drinking,
Yeah.
right? Because that's
Actually,
a
I realize
specific
that's
thing.
kind of smart because as you said, psychologically, we've had movies and imagery of vampires as psychic vampires, as energy vampires, not always just blood.
Yeah, that certainly comes up. So when in like modern things with like the psychic energy and things, right?
Yeah.
But so in the folklore, blood drinking comes up, but vampires sometimes they were just thought to kill people or like strangle them in the night or kind of
Hmm.
assault people when they encountered them and stuff like that. There's different things would be blamed on vampires. Like there was once I think I was alluding to earlier. There's one story where there was like a drought and the people blamed the person who had died for causing the drought,
Mm-hmm.
right? So right there, it's the dead are harming the living in some way. So it's getting to it's the fear of the dead, right? Like that's part of this. And so that's, I think, important to kind of sort of stay focused on. So I cast a bit of a wider net there and say they're harming the living in some way. Maybe it's blood drinking, but maybe it's something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, my last criteria was in order to destroy the vampire, to dispatch it, action has to be taken against the corpse itself.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
yeah, so it's not like it's some kind of disembodied spirit that's like a ghost or something like that, right?
Right.
Like that's just sort of doesn't have any tether to the physical realm. Like vampires are they're kind of corporeal by their
Mm-hmm.
nature. There's a physicality to them. They're physical. So that was another thing for me where it's like, no, like if it comes up in the story that like they had to get rid of them or something like that, like it has the corpse has to be in play in some fashion.
Right.
So
Exactly.
that's yeah. So that's
Now,
kind of so those are my criteria.
okay. And did you? And I'm sure somebody's asked you this already, but also perfectly good criteria to use for a zombie.
I suppose so. And I mean, I think when you look at the some of the vampire stuff, it seems to our modern minds more reminiscent of sometimes kind of reminiscent of like a zombie movie or something.
Yeah,
Where you have
that
like
was
this
what I was thinking earlier when I was talking about how they cross over one another in ways.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would say probably the biggest difference. And I'm probably making some generalizations about zombie movies, but like zombies are often kind of like decaying, right?
Yeah.
They're kind of like withering and skeletal or something like
Well,
that, right?
except for modern reimaginations in which they're having love affairs with their teen boyfriend. But yeah,
Well,
it's.
Yeah. So I mean, I know for me when I think of like a zombie, like a cartoon zombie or something like that, like I don't know, his like arms falling off or something like that, and he's like
Yeah,
grinning
we've
and whatnot.
we seem to have dumbed
Um,
them down in our modern interpretation, and then had them eat brains instead of drink blood.
they eat brains too.
That's right.
But one kind of difference there I'll get into with vampires. Is that when we think of it like sort of I'm talking about zombies here, but sort of vampires, we often think of them as kind of pale and thin and kind of like deathly pallor and that sort of thing, and that is not what the folkloric view of it was. They
Oh.
did not think vampires looked that way.
How did they look?
They they looked good. They looked healthy.
Okay.
They looked like they were still alive, right?
Okay.
And see, that's an important distinction to make because when I guess let me kind of take you through sort of like sort of like just a sort of generalized description of kind of what might happen, right? So so you have say it's 1700s, sort of a rural village in 1700s, something like that, and somebody sort of unexpectedly passes away. They die sort of all of a sudden. That's strange. Then another person passes away. Maybe it was a friend or a relative or something like that. And then another, young, kind of fairly young person passes away suddenly. Like what's going on here, right? Something's wrong. These people who shouldn't be dying yet are now suddenly dying, right? They get sick, they get ill, and then they pass away, and then another person. So, when we look at that with the modern eye, we go, oh, there's some kind of infection going on, right? Like there's a disease, and like, maybe it's getting passed from person to person or something like that. When you go back to, the 1700s or something like that, there's no germ theory, right? They don't, that hasn't come around yet. They're looking for an explanation. So then sort of they think to themselves, well, it kind of all started when that first person died, right? Let's have a look at that first. Let's have a look at that first person. Let's see what's going on. They dig this person up. They would expect to see a corpse that is withering, decomposing, turning to a skeleton, right? But they didn't necessarily understand the decomposition process. So different things can happen in the decomposition process, depending on a number of variables. But if they exhumed the corpse and the corpse looked too well preserved, like it hadn't died, right? And maybe that's because it got buried in the winter. So it didn't, that kind of preserved it or something like that. Or it hadn't been dead that long.
Or the climate or whatever.
Climate, whatever. Yeah. So maybe they see this corpse. It looks like it did in life. It looks fresh, right? Maybe the person looks like they've gained weight, right? They're actually bigger now. They're plumper now than they were. They look healthier, right? That can happen because during decomposition, gases can build up and the body can bloat.
Yep.
So that can be misinterpreted as weight gain. There's a number of other things. Reddishness in the face. The face looks flush, right? Which also can happen as part of it due to like blood pooling and things like that. So they see these things and they're like, wait a minute, this person's been dead for some months or whatever, and they look healthier now than they did before. They must be somehow taking the life, the vitality of the living, and preserving their own vitality in death. Right.
So somehow somebody one day made that. Some bright spark made that connection. Hey, I know what's going on here.
I know what's going on here.
This guy is up to no good.
This guy. And so, they were trying to make sense of the world around them, and they saw something that didn't make sense. And so they're trying to sort of put two and two together. They're trying to explain a situation that's, strange or whatever. And so that's what they would find. The other thing that could happen in decomposition is that blood or fluids can come out of the mouth. So they would dig someone up, they'd see blood around the mouth, and they'd go, wait a minute, that's the blood that this person took from the living. Right. And so now we've got to do something to, save ourselves from this undead person.
Did they actually, now the fact that they had to dig this corpse up would have indicated to them that they had to dig the corpse up. I mean, in what way did they think this corpse was getting out and doing the damage it was doing? Did they think that it crawled out of there?
That's all right. That's a great question. I talk about this in the book. I actually kind of dedicate a chapter to this.
Oh, okay. Because it seems the most obvious thing, Like,
how the heck did it get out?
Right.
How the heck did it get out? So there's different sort of explanations and discussions around this. There were some beliefs that it was that if you found like a small hole, like a small hole around the grave, like a snake could go through or something like that, that was an indication that there was a vampire there. So the vampire was escaping through this hole, right? This tiny hole.
Oh, wow. So is that where the idea of the transmogrification comes from, of changing into other shapes and then changing
other shapes back? And stuff like that? I mean, I talk about like the changing into animals and stuff like that, which I think there's sort of other things relating to that.
Yeah.
And the whole and that wasn't universal. That was like, and it's very hard to sort of speak with sort of a broad brush with a lot of the specifics of these, because again, these are supernatural beliefs. They differ from place to place.
Right.
So I was finding, like, I would sort of just go like, oh well, what, oh, this is here or this is there, and I kind of talk about beliefs from all over the place. So, but sort of the hole in the grave, I thought was sort of, that's an interesting one. It's also interesting because it kind of gives the vampire like it's a little bit less corporeal in that form. It has a more of a supernatural quality because it's escaping through the hole in some fashion, which
exactly.
is interesting. There was one tale about it was a not so pious monk who passed away and was terrorizing people. And so the tale kind of talks about these other monks kind of lie in wait for him at night to put an end to them. And it's cold, and like all the monks go away except one, and he's waiting. And that's the point where the vampire decides like, oh, this is the moment, because there's only one person. So in the story, it talks about like the ground kind of just opens up and he emerges or whatever.
Okay.
So like there was another one where it was that's a bit more of a fantastical tale, right? Where like you have the ground kind of opening for him.
So they have there we are assigning supernatural powers to the creature as well.
Yeah. So it's somehow it's kind of escaping that in that way. So and in that sense, it kind of stays whole, right? Its body remains, without changing or something like that.
Right. Hey everyone, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you about a service that I am endorsing and that I truly, truly believe in. And that service is called BetterHelp, H-E-L-P, BetterHelp. And they are available through betterhelp.com. And this is a service that connects you with a licensed professional counselor online so you can get help with depression, anxiety, stress, or just somebody to talk to in this very troubled times that we're living in right now. It is not easy to get out there in the big wide world right now. It is not easy to get out and see therapists or counselors. It is not easy to find counselors or therapists who can help you. And this is what BetterHelp was designed to assist you with. The simplicity of this is you go to the site, you sign up. Actually, you use the link that I have provided below, which is betterhelp.com/Chris Shelton, and you get signed up. And this can be for as little as $40 a week. And they actually even have financial aid available. You enter some information, fill out a questionnaire about yourself, and you get hooked up with a counselor that will help you out. And this can be via text, via voice, or via video. Okay, any one of those. It's up to you and your comfort level. And if the therapist that you get connected with isn't doing the job that you feel you need, you can ask for and get a different counselor. So there are a lot of options for you in this, and it is really something that I think a lot of my viewers should be taking advantage of. I have talked often about the need for, or the help that you can get through professional counseling. Sometimes you need somebody who really does know what they're doing and not just a friend or family member to listen. And that's why this service is something that I am happy to put out there for you guys. So again, use the link below, betterhelp.com/Chris Shelton. That is in the description to this video. And I hope that you can get the help that you might need from this service. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah, so there was sort of a church scholar, an abbot, Dom Augustin Calmet, who he writes this kind of treatise on the supernatural and vampires and revenants. Probably important to point out, vampire was not the universal term used for these things at all. That's not something I went by in the book. Just because someone didn't call it a vampire doesn't mean it wasn't a vampire. You know what I mean? Like there's a bunch of names for these things depending on where you go. The vampire is not a universal term.
Cool.
So he talks about this, and he kind of proposes some answers to this question that you have. And one of the things he thinks is like, could it be possible that the vampire can change the nature of its body such that it can pass through soil the way water does?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So there was another kind of idea there. He also wonders if vampires were simply an illusion, that they didn't exist at all. He was actually trying to like get to the root of this thing.
Hmm.
Because because he was obviously he was a priest, right? He was part of the church, and so his view was like, well, we need to figure out what these things are, because they're either vampires aren't true, and then we have an obligation to like inform the public that they're not true, or they are true, and if that's the case, then they're evil and they're from the devil, and we need to help people protect themselves. So he kind of wrote this book trying to get to the bottom of it, because vampires, there was a number of newspaper articles like in the 1700s, and they were getting some like popular attention towards them, and people were wondering about them. But so he had that idea that, well, maybe they're just illusions entirely. Pardon me?
Who was this person again?
Augustin Calmet.
Augustin Calmet.
Calmet, yeah, Calmet.
Okay, Calmet.
He was a French abbot. He was a French abbot. Yeah,
and he was a priest detective.
He was trying to get to the bottom of things. So he had a lot of stories. He included a lot of stories
about this guy. Come on, it's just waiting to happen. This is like the priest detective, man.
Yeah, right.
I like it. Well, I like here's what I like. I like the fact that on the table of options for him was that they don't exist.
Yeah, I mean, he was trying to figure things out. He thought that maybe he's like, well, they could be an illusion created by like the devil or something like that.
Yeah.
So he kind of did this stuff.
Using the old noggin there at that time.
Use the old noggin. But so the how the vampires get out is actually sort of an interesting question. I mean, I think ultimately at the end of the day, a lot of accounts don't mention it. They don't go into detail. The fact of the matter was that they were doing something.
Right.
They were escaping in some fashion. In fact, there was one belief where the vampire spirit would leave the grave, and then it would get a new body. Like this new body would materialize.
Right. There we go.
So there was a bunch of different approaches, but some people never bought. Some accounts, like, they don't mention how it's happening. They're just like, look, this is happening.
Right.
Like, we got to do something. Doesn't matter how it's happening.
Is there any truth, since we're kind of talking about this burial thing right now, it's on my mind, is there any truth to this old idea that one of the causes for the actual real world causes for why people imagine that the undead could rise is because they actually were burying people who were still alive sometimes, and they dig themselves up? Now, I've read that years and years and years ago, to the point that it became a practice to put a cord in the coffin and a bell up on the surface. Is any of that true?
Okay, so yeah, so the cord and the bell thing. So that particular thing dates from that was like a Victorian thing. So
was it?
There was
okay.
Yeah.
I
so
thought
there
it was much earlier. Okay.
So yeah, I think the cord with the bell, I want to say was Victorian times, I believe. I did not get into that in the book, so I can't. Okay. You can fact check me if you want there. But it was in like Victorian times, like sometimes it was kind of hard to tell if someone was dead. So there was like this fear that some people had that they would be buried alive. So that's why people had these ideas about like, well, these are the mechanisms, to like, if you get buried alive, this is kind of like how you'll get out or something like that. Okay. So it's kind of like a public fear, like a fear in the public about that, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. Again, speaking to a different kind of fear surrounding death. The buried alive thing, people have proposed that as like that, maybe that's the root of the vampire stories, is that people were getting buried alive. The thing of it is, when you look at the recorded historical accounts of these things, right? Like some of the stuff I talk about in the book, like some of these are more like their supernatural beliefs, like vampires will do XYZ, or they're legends and they're kind of hazy, and they may date back very far. But a number of these things, like these were events that were written about in newspapers, where they were like exhuming corpses because of an illness or something like that. And so for those kinds of things, people weren't buried alive for that. You know what I mean? So if you look at some of the actual, like the kind of more harder evidence, it was usually relating to a misunderstanding the decomposition process, a fear surrounding some kind of illness or misfortune or something like that.
Okay. That makes sense. That totally makes sense, of course.
I'm not going to say that never happened, but that someone didn't get buried alive and then someone thought it was a vampire afterwards, something like that. I mean,
there were stories.
Who knows, right?
I mean, there were stories, and whether they were true stories, of course, is always the question. When you're talking about retellings of things, then, I mean, it's entirely possible that they're just totally fake. So I wouldn't be the first time in history that, some kind of nonsense had filtered up to the present time.
I mean, it's hard. Truth. It's hard to know. It's very hard to know. You know what I mean? Like it's that there may be some accounts that happened where someone got buried and they came out and people freaked out about it, which they probably would.
Yeah, I definitely read some accounts like that. I remember that very clearly now. What about, since you take this on a trait by trait sort of exploration, and I am definitely curious about a couple of these traits, if I might ask you, holy water.
Yeah, holy water, absolutely. Holy water and sort of religious iconography in general is absolutely part of vampire folklore. Mm-hmm. That's there in a variety of stories, used in a variety of ways. I think that comes down to sort of the good versus evil aspect of things, right? That people believe that the vampire is an evil entity, and thus, sort of religious items will help protect them from evil. In this case, being the vampire.
Okay. So the cross is part of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But a Jewish cross could be part of that theoretically.
I mean, in theory, the accounts that I tended to, and I guess I should say like, what I'm referring to here, the accounts that I ran across that were from people who were Christian, right? So they believed that this cross was going to protect them, right? That was part of their belief system.
Oh, right? That makes more sense, actually. It's funny, after all these years, I've never actually connected those two ideas. But of course they would connect right away. The cross will protect me, not just from vampires. The cross will protect me from everything.
Sure, yeah.
Cross is your symbol,
Yeah, sure. The power, it's the, God, your power of God, right?
Right.
So that was part of folkloric vampire beliefs for people who were Christian.
Right.
So if you went to somewhere where they didn't have that, then that wouldn't be mentioned, but it could be, it could potentially be some other kind of sacred thing to whatever place you were at that would help them or something.
Well, that's translated to modern storytelling of vampires. I mean, I'm looking at Salem's Lot. I'm looking at, Fright Night. I mean, there's a lot of places this pops up, this line of, well, it's not the symbol that's actually doing it. It's your faith, right? You have to have faith. Otherwise, the cross doesn't work, right? This was in Fright Night. This was in Salem's Lot, right? And that's the thing that is giving you the power to repel this evil beast. And so it's not so people can sit there and do this all day, or get a crucifix or something and flash it, and it still won't work because they don't have faith.
Sure. I mean, and that notion, connects to Catholicism, that kind of thing. Your faith has healed you.
That's right. What about, now you said 12th century when I asked you earlier about earliest time. So did you go earlier as far as was there conceivably any concept of this in the Egyptian culture or the Roman culture or the Greek cultures or Chinese cultures or Asian cultures back in the day?
Sure. China, I talk about there's like a Chinese version of the vampire called the Qiangxi. I share a story about that, but it's an undead person who's tormenting the living and killing people. So I talk about a tale. They were believed to have like stiff limbs, and I think that like long hair and stuff like that. In the story I share, like they also had the ability to fly. They could like fly through the air, like a superhero. So like there was one tale where the the villagers, they go to like the tomb or the cave where the Qiangxi lives, and they have a magician. He casts like a magical net over the sky so it can't fly away, and and they someone runs into the cave and rings bells that keep it from returning and that kind of thing.
Interesting.
So there was that. In the story I talk about in the book, I talk about. So this is one where I talk about this something called an impusa, which which is often linked to vampires, and sometimes kind of gets referred to as one. And it drinks blood and consumes flesh, and it has these. It looks like a person. It's had these powers of illusion. There's a story of this young man who falls in love with this beautiful woman, and he's going to marry her, and his friend, who's like a philosopher, he tries to warn him that this woman is actually an impusa, and he doesn't believe him. But then at the wedding, like the philosopher accuses her, and she ultimately kind of acknowledges, she feigns, kind of feigns offense, but then ultimately acknowledges that, yes, it's I am. And so then suddenly like the whole wedding is like an illusion, like all like the finery and all that like disappears because it was all from her power.
It was all illusion. Wow.
Yeah. It was all a big illusion. So like that one gets brought up with vampire accounts a lot. And it was one I talk about in my book. It's like a classic, it's, like a classical story. But
what time period? What time period is that story from?
So I think, like, classical Rome or something like that. I'm not exactly sure of the date.
Oh, that's Roman. That's a Roman story.
I think it was either Roman. I think it's set in like the Roman or Greek period, I think.
Oh, I was misunderstanding. I thought that was the Chinese one. Okay, so that's
Oh,
old.
sorry. That's I shift gears on you. My apologies.
Got it.
So the Qiangxi was a Chinese one. The Impusa was like a classical period Greek Roman or whatever.
Okay. So this concept is older.
It is. Now, the thing about the Impusa is that it's not like a dead person. It's like a creature, and it consumes blood and eats flesh and has some powers, but
it's not
that's
dead.
one where I'm like, is this really a vampire?
No, right? Not if it's not undead.
So that's that. So you get into stuff like that. So I mean, so if you're looking at like Egyptian. Like, and then there's like the Egyptian mythology, like one of their gods was thought to like drink the Nile and consume blood and stuff like that. So sometimes that gets brought up. But then again, like, well, that's like a supernatural being that wasn't necessarily a corpse. Of course, the Egyptians, if you're talking about corpses and stuff like that, they had a very rich, sort of rich idea of the afterlife and the supernatural and stuff.
That's right. Yeah, they weren't walking around in fear of the undead walking among them. They had Book of the Dead. They had this really figured out what was going on.
They had a very well established system of beliefs regarding that stuff. So it's hard to say how, again, it depends on how you want to define the vampire in terms of what old stories kind of relate to it or not.
Right.
But I honestly, like, to me, I would imagine it dates back very, very, very farther than probably people wrote it down. Because these are sort of universal concepts, right? And probably like, part of our sort of collective unconsciousness is fear of death and mortality and things like that.
That's right.
So,
and then the dead rising up to come, suck your life away because they want to live longer. I mean, it's a bizarre computation that sort of thing would happen. But then when you break it all down, like you've been doing, you kind of go, oh no, I get how this happens.
Yeah. Well, death is a scary thing. People don't want to die, right? I don't, that's a scary thing. So then when someone around you, someone does die, like, you don't want to be like them. You don't want that to happen to you too. And you don't want them to bring you towards it. So what, you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of this kind of concern regarding that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what about, okay, good. So in terms of, again, I got so many questions. Okay. Sunlight.
Sunlight. I get, well, actually, what's your guess?
Well, I mean, I think nighttime is associated with the dark things and, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. They seem to, certainly in Western Europe, they made holidays or special events or days out of the eve before the day of the event. I mean, that's where we get Halloween from.
Mm-hmm. Samhain?
Yeah, so I'm so I'm a little open to the idea, but I think it's not a stretch for me to think that nighttime equals dark creatures, bad things coming out because you can't see that much, so the threats are much more. They can get much closer to you before you're even aware of them. Whereas during the day, you get the sun and the light and all that. But that's I don't know. I'm just making that up.
So so I'll kind of I'll go into it a little bit. So
Okay.
ultimately, I will say that it was never believed that sunlight would destroy the vampire.
Oh,
Okay,
that's a modern thing.
that is a modern thing.
Okay, because that's
So
not
the
even in
notion
Dracula. I think Dracula comes out during the day.
he does, yes,
Yeah.
he's not bound by the night.
Yeah, they don't kill
Um,
him by exposing him to sunlight.
no, no,
Yeah.
they don't. So that notion where the vampire gets exposed to the sunlight and they're like this, and they crumble to dust or whatever,
Yeah,
which
that
is
whole
great.
thing.
This is great. It's very theatrical and it looks great. So that was never believed. Um, there's there's some difference among the tales and the places about what sunlight might mean to the vampire. So there are vampires by and large, they attacked at the night. They were nocturnal,
Hmm.
right? People were terrorized at the night, and there's a number of explanations as to why. We can go into that a bit. Um, and some of the accounts, people said that person who died, they came to me last night and they were on top of me and they were strangling me, right? Like people said
Wow.
that.
Wow.
Yes, yeah. They believe this. So vampires very much nocturnal, very much sort of creatures of the night. There you go. Depending on the place. So let's say the in Greece there was quite a big it's kind of vampire tradition. There the vampire was known as the Vrikolakas in Greece,
Hmm.
and so there was some beliefs that it could be seen out and about during the day. You might encounter one, and if you did, sometimes it was so scary people would die, people would pass away.
Wow.
Yeah, there was another story. There was another story I recall. That one might have been from the 1600s, where the vampire was attacking people at night, but at times it was seen walking around at noon.
Okay.
That kind of thing. So there were
Okay.
some accounts where it was seen at during the day, wasn't hurting it. There are a number of accounts where at at dawn the vampire would become lifeless, right? So these are kind of tales and legends where oftentimes it involves like a soldier traveling or something like that, and they encounter a corpse vampire, and they're being chased or something like that. And then when the dawn approaches, the rooster crows is often what's said. The vampire falls lifeless to the ground, like clunk, and then they escape. Right, they get
Oh.
away.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
but the thing of it is that in these stories, the sunlight doesn't kill that vampire. It just kind of deanimates them,
Right.
so they become lifeless again. But But the implication is that they are going to come back to life at night. In fact, one tale, this happens. The soldier he meets this it's a vampire of a warlock, and the warlock, I guess, in his hubris, kind of explains to the soldier, if you really want to kill me, here's what you have to do. But then the warlock tries to kill the soldier, the vampire warlock. But then the soldier tries to defend himself. The sunlight comes up, the vampire falls lifeless. So now the soldier has time to actually do what the vampire said to do, to kill him for real, which was build a bonfire of aspen wood, and you put the corpse on it. And he said, and any creature that came out of it, you had to kill, otherwise he would survive. So in that case, and in a number of other kind of legends, the vampire was being made lifeless temporarily during the sunlight hours, but that wasn't killing them or anything like that.
Okay.
And when you look at some of like we talked about some of these more historic accounts, that makes sense that the sunlight wouldn't do anything. Because when you think about it, these people are scared, they're frightened, they've got to do something to get rid of this corpse that's killing people. If you had just dug them up and just left them out in the sun for 10 minutes or something like that, is that gonna make the people feel better? Is that where the catharsis is?
Right.
You know, it doesn't.
No.
You know, I don't think it's going to do the job.
Well, there's a lot
they need
more.
to take real action.
There's a lot more catharsis to be had in beheading it and ripping its heart out, and then shoving a garlic clove in there. So,
yes, absolutely.
I'd
now you feel like
dead.
you did something.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's coming back tonight. I don't think it is.
That's it.
Nope.
Problem solved. You know, like, did you take care of that vampire? Well, I left it in the sun for half an hour and then we reburied it. No.
It's coming back. What are you talking about? That didn't do anything.
Right. So in my book, so this is the kind of example where I look to the folklore. I find things that related to the current belief. I kind of explore these and I share these legends and stuff like that. But then I kind of like say, well, but that doesn't answer the question really. So when did sunlight start killing vampires? For in our sort of perception. So that can actually be traced back to a 1920s silent film called Nosferatu.
Oh, that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe you've heard of that. Nosferatu, Ein Sinfonie du Grauen, something like that. That's Symphony of Terror.
Yeah. He's got
the he's the bald with the pointy ears. He's got like the rat-like fangs, in the front. The hands.
Yeah, those hands are huge.
It's great, great movie. Good, like, so the powerful visuals in that film. I mean, obviously, it's by our standards now. I mean, this is the 1920s, right? But
that's right. Shadow of the Vampire was a great.
Oh, that was the one. Yeah, where they were like that. The premise was they were shooting Nosferatu, right?
Correct. That's right.
Yes,
but the Nosferatu was real.
Yes, that they were shooting a vampire movie with a real vampire.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Willem Dafoe played the Nosferatu, and he was brilliant. It was really quite good. It was quite good.
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie in such a long time. Okay. So anyway, so in that movie, the vampire whose name is Count Orlok. He's terrorizing London. So in the plot of the film, they have this book that kind of explains the vampire legend, and in this book, it explains the ritual to destroy the vampire. Mm-hmm. And the ritual is that someone has to willingly give themselves up to the vampire, give their blood to the vampire, such that he stays there drinking the blood for the entire night until dawn, and at dawn he'll be destroyed. So in the movie, one of the main characters makes the sacrifice and he drinks the blood, and then he's leaving the room, walking past the window, and then the sun appears over the horizon, and he kind of does this dramatic turn, and then the next frame is that there's just smoke rising from the ground. So that's kind of where we first get the notion of sunlight killing the vampire, destroying him. But it's interesting. Because when you actually look at the plot of the movie, and this was kind of pointed out by a scholar, a vampire expert, Raymond T. McNally, he points out that, well, it wasn't necessarily the sunlight alone that killed the vampire. The sunlight was part of the ritual to destroy the vampire, which involved a victim and stuff like that. So it may actually have been the whole ritual required. So if that's the case with the plot, then actually the notion of sunlight destroying the vampire is a bit of a misinterpretation of the film, which is kind of an interesting idea.
That is an interesting idea. Or alternately, the sunlight was the key component of the ritual, and the rest of it was just fluff.
Fluff just to get him there.
Exactly.
Entirely possible. Hard to say.
So you can have it both ways. Yeah, it's a tough one.
You can have it both. You can have it both ways. But an interesting thing about Nosferatu, so that was done by the production company for that was Prana Film, and they wanted to do a vampire one. They wanted to do a Dracula movie, but they did not get the rights to Dracula. But they made what they did was they just changed some elements of the plot. They changed some character names, right? It's Count Orlok now and all this stuff. And they came out with the movie, and this is 1920s. Bram Stoker's widow sues them and wins, and the judge rules that all copies of the film are to be destroyed. But thankfully, some of the copies survive, and we still have the film today. And
Got
it's
it.
sort of a great classic piece of vampire movie
Very much
making. And
so.
so yeah, so that's kind of an interesting one. So there's kind of the story around Sunlight, and so then obviously from there, kind of the rest is history. It sort of makes its way into other other movies and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. Um,
Yeah.
oh, I was just thinking about something I wanted to ask you about with, yeah, the blood drinking. So if it wasn't always that way, when did it consistently become that way?
Well, the blood drinking comes up quite a bit. I mean, it comes up in the folklore. So here's sort of there was one account. This is 1720s. This fellow by the name of Peter Plagojewicz in Serbia. He dies. People people after him start dying. They believe that he's the cause. In the account, people say he came to me at night. He was crushing me, strangling me, and that kind of thing. So the people of the village kind of they're up in arms about this thing, and this vampire's terrorizing them. So strangling people in the night. And so they go to kind of this government official, and they're like, well, we want to exhume this guy. And the government official was kind of like, let me ask my boss. But they were like, no, we need to do this now or we're all leaving the village. So he agrees. They dig up the body of Plagojewicz. When they inspect it, they see the blood around the mouth. That's the blood he's been sucking. It really wasn't discussed before then, but they see the blood around the mouth, and that's kind of what keys it off. So the blood drinking came most likely from that misinterpretation of the decomposition process where they saw blood around the mouth, and that kind of keyed it in for them of like, oh, that's the thing. That's
Wow.
what's going on.
That's
So
interesting.
that's
That's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. Yeah,
And
it
okay,
makes sense. You look at this corpse and you see that there, and like, well, that shouldn't be there,
yeah,
So
well, yeah, at least according to their way of thinking. Um,
exactly.
what? Okay, is there any truth to the um, Vlad the Impaler legend? Is the straight line trajectory to Dracula?
Um, so a little bit. Um, there's if you watch like a documentary about vampires or something like that, Vlad the Impaler is now going to come up
Yep,
like totally. Like they're going to do a whole segment on him and stuff like that, and be like, this was the source for Count Dracula,
that's right.
and this is Stoker. He knew all about this guy, and he did all this. So the thing of it is that Stoker knew extremely little about Vlad the Impaler.
Mm.
That is sort of that you can prove through sort of like documentary evidence, right? People have conjectured that he read all about him and this and that, but from what I've read from some of the scholarly research that I've read, he basically learned about Vlad the Impaler from kind of like a single line in one book. About, I think the book was called like the history of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia or something like that. And he reads this one line that talks about this prince in Wallachia who was named Dracula, and he was he was kind of like a victorious warrior on the battlefield or something like that. And it mentions that Dracula means devil.
Mm.
And that's kind of about it. It doesn't even mention his name's like Vlad. It's a very limited reference. But Stoker saw that reference in this book, liked the name and liked the notion of this prince, fighting these wars against like the Ottoman Empire and stuff. And so that's kind of, he took that and incorporated that into his book. So that's kind of where it was. I think before he was going to call the character Count Dracula, I think it was going to be like Count Vampire or something like that. Oh. So he liked the name. He liked the idea that there's a section in the book where Van Helsing's talking about Dracula and kind of his history, and mentions like he had these great victories against, against the Turks and stuff like that. And so you can kind of tell like, oh yeah, Stoker read that little bit of it there. There's a lot of people that think like, well, Stoker had access to these people or this information, and he might have like known a lot more about Vlad or something like that. But there's not a lot of evidence to really support that. And Dr. Elizabeth Miller kind of wrote a lot about this and really kind of dug into this stuff. So you can look for her work if you want to know more about kind of Stoker's connections here. But I think one thing that kind of gets asserted is that like, if Stoker knew a lot more about it, he probably would have said more in the book, because that's kind of how Stoker rolled. Like he wasn't necessarily holding things back if he had, he had stuff.
Especially that kind of backstory. I mean, Vlad the Impaler's backstory is like, are you kidding me right now? This is exactly what Dracula would be, I mean, he was
a rough dude. And I think it's important to mention that no one during Vlad the Impaler's time thought that Vlad was a vampire.
Okay.
Right. He didn't know. People did not think he was a vampire or something like that.
Or that he was. Now, wasn't there something in the legend about him bathing in blood or something?
So, the bathing in blood was the Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess.
Oh, right. Right.
Who also comes up in those documentaries a lot.
That's right. That's right. There we go. Yes. I'm mixing them. Mixing them up.
Yes. Yep. Yes. So Vlad, there was this assertion that there was this poem that was written about Vlad, back in the day, that he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims and eat it. Right. Okay. Which is kind of vampiric, but it kind of turns out that was a mistranslation, and it actually was that he washed his hands in the blood of his victims, which again is pretty creepy.
No, but it makes it a lot better.
Pretty creepy still.
But Jesus, dude. Oh yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Stuff. Yeah. Done and done. But not vampiric.
Okay.
Right. So, and I mean, I think that the thing about Vlad is he was an extremely brutal ruler.
Yeah.
But of course those were very brutal times as well that he lived in.
Yeah.
He was Prince of Wallachia, which was a principality. Now it's a region in Romania. And he was technically his title was like voivode. So, and he actually ruled 3 separate times, because he like lost the throne a couple times, because there was like he had to deal with like sort of rebellious nobles and stuff like that. He had Hungary on one side of him, which was like this like superpower. He had like the Ottomans on the other side of him,
right.
and so you had like tiny Wallachia in there fighting fighting these battles and stuff like that. So it was definitely like to in no way excuse him from any of the atrocities that he performed, but it was an interesting time period for sure, and kind of that's how he kept his rule, was through fear.
Right. So I guess the nicest thing they could say about him back then was, well, he's not a vampire.
Yeah, he's not a vampire.
Correct.
So, and he wasn't known as like Vlad the Impaler in his time. Like that came later. Sometimes you get Vlad Tepes, which is Romanian for impaler. He was known. He would have been Vlad the Third or Vlad Dracula. His father was Dracul, which his father was part of the Order of the Dragon, which was like this knighthood that was sort of which was created to kind of defend Christendom and that kind of thing. And then he was Dracula, which was so Dracula means dragon or devil, and then he was Dracula, the son of the dragon.
Right.
So that's kind of where they got his moniker there.
I mean, it is definitely. I mean, Bram Stoker really hit pay dirt with that name.
Yeah.
That is
fantastic name.
oh
But from what I understand these days in Romania, that Vlad has kind of taken on kind of like he's sort of like has like kind of a heroic kind of status, because he fought for his country and defended his country from invasion and that kind of thing. So he's kind of taken on that kind of role.
interesting.
So it's kind of interesting because, obviously he's an historical ruler and, a previous ruler there. So,
Yeah, of course.
he's not fictional.
Right.
So I think that's interesting.
It is. It's very interesting. And thank you for clarifying all of that. I knew there was going to be some kind of story there. I knew it couldn't be that, A to B, direct dot. This was the guy and he was bathing in blood and all that. Now, I have one last thing to ask you about, and then maybe I guess we'll move toward wrapping up. This has been a fascinating conversation, but I have to ask you about this. It seems that there are some traits or some things that we think about or look at with some of these creatures that are really just one person's idea that somehow caught hold. The sunlight thing with Nosferatu is a great example of that. Somebody thought of that, wrote it into the story, and there it is, right? And it's
Yes.
and it's somebody trying to make it different from the source material, Dracula, right? So it's literally
maybe to avoid litigation,
right? And here we have this what turned out to be a major decision on the part of vampire lore, because from there on out, vampires are pretty much defined that way. If you see vampires running around the daytime, you're like, hey, wait a second, that's not right. Just from that one decision point. Later, we move forward to now, and we face other individual decisions that I think are individual decisions. That's why I wanted to ask you about it. With this sort of intro of this is Stephenie Meyer, right? With the Twilight series, which I absolutely despise. I cannot stand any part of that. But the sparkly skin. They sparkle in the sunlight, right? Not only can her vampires come out during the day, but they fucking sparkle, right? So what do you think of that personally, for one? And then two, is that based on something earlier, or is that just Stephenie Meyer making stuff up?
So in terms of sparks, I don't really get into that in the book. I do recall there was one belief where some people believe that the vampire kind of had like a life cycle to it. It didn't just kind of like pop out of the ground. And for a while it was incorporeal. It didn't have a body, and then it would kind of like get a body afterwards. And I think there was one reference to like it had kind of you would see sparks or something like that when it was incorporeal or something. So
wow.
I vaguely remember that. But in terms of like a vampire kind of kind of sparkling in the sun or something like that, not so much. One of the accounts also had a vampire. I'm sorry, I'm just sort of thinking on the fly here.
Yeah.
One of the accounts had like when the vampire got a new body, it kind of had like kind of a misty aura about it or something like that. There's a lot of stories, and it's hard to keep them all straight sometimes. I try my best. That's why I wrote it all down in a book.
No, dude, and good on you, because I'm just picking your brain here, but that is a thing about legends, lore, storytelling. I mean, that writers have imaginations, and they want to bring something new and different to the genre to make their spin an original spin. And sometimes it takes hold and sometimes it doesn't. I don't think Stephenie Meyer's sparkly skin is going to continue on. I think it's going to die with her, but I'm wondering, about other things.
So here's the thing about that is, getting back to Varney the Vampire, that was the 19th century work that introduced fangs. So Varney had fangs.
Yep.
Right. So that was that was like a new concept. Right. It mentions he had fangs, and it mentions the two bite marks in the neck. Right.
But come from the fangs, right?
Yes, exactly. So before that, vampires didn't have fangs. Couple mentions of vampires having elongated teeth, which like people often, I think a modern reader reads that, oh, those are the fangs. It's like, well, it didn't say fangs. It said they had longer teeth, and there's like only a couple references to that, right? So when people read Varney for the first time, the fangs, it's like that kind of that stuck, right? It was like, it was good. It resonated with the audience, and it got incorporated into future incarnations of the vampire. So the vampire is always growing and changing. So I know, so some folks have kind of like the idea of what a vampire is supposed to be, and then kind of they don't necessarily kind of like so maybe a new interpretation or changes or something like that. But the thing of it is that it's always been changing. It's been
Right.
changing for hundreds of years, and it will continue, and it will likely continue to do so. So will the sparkles stick around? It depends. There's a lot of, I mean, that was a big book series and a big movie series. A lot of people sort of grew up with that, and it's kind of part of their ideas about vampires and stuff like that. So when those people go on, some of them may become movie makers or authors. Something, are they going to incorporate that because that's what resonates with them?
Right.
It's hard to say. I mean, I was thinking the other day, it's in another 100, if I had written this book 100 years, 100 years in the future, right? Is someone going to be like, oh, like the way I was talking about Bram Stoker, like you can't overstate what Bram Stoker did. Like, will they be saying that about, Stephanie Meyer? It's hard.
God,
it's hard. It's hard to know.
I know. I know.
It's so hard to know.
You're spot on. You are absolutely correct. And so, of course, I have no leg to stand on when I say the classic vampire trope is. I'm well aware of that. This is a multi-generational thing, and that's what happens is one generation has their classic view, and then the next generation changes it up because that's what we do.
That is what we do. And I think it depends on what speaks to the people and the culture at the time.
That's right.
Right. So you look at, the vampire legends and accounts from, from folklore. And like we said, like that was the vampires fulfilling a need there, right? There was a need for explanation and for blame and, for some kind of solution. And so, it fit the need. That was its purpose. When we look at the vampire nowadays, well, kind of what gets brought up a lot about the vampire nowadays? Well, we understand, that people can catch diseases and infections, stuff like that. We understand changes in the weather or whatever, or those kinds of things. But nowadays, I feel like oftentimes what's talked about with vampires a lot is their immortality. They stay young forever. They stay beautiful forever, and that kind of thing. And I think that's emphasized a lot more now because it resonates with us, because aging and death haven't yet been defeated by science.
That's a really good point.
So
it's a good point.
So I think that's oftentimes the focus of the vampires now, is that you have this creature that has overcome death, but they pay a price for that. Right. They're now cursed in some fashion because of that. So again, that also might be speaking to us in a way that says, like, maybe, nature, the course of nature shouldn't be subverted, and there's a price to pay if it is. And so that might be what resonates with audiences today.
That's right. And that's been, I was just thinking of The Hunger. Just had to look up the title, right? The 1983, Tony Scott directed, Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie, and Susan Sarandon in a vampire movie. And these vampires were like really old. I mean, these guys went back to Egypt, with their immortality. And so they had these little knives with ankhs. They didn't have the fangs. They had these little knives they would use. But, so everybody has their own spin on it. But the reason I thought of that was the concentration on immortality. And in fact, this is for my viewers, for those of you who know my background and all that, which of course should be most of you, I was very heavily involved in a cult for a long time. And one of the key tenets of that group was immortality, achieving immortality, not bodily immortality, but spiritual immortality. You would, your body will die, but you go get another one. And I believed that for years. I don't believe it anymore. I've definitely moved on from that. But one of the things that actually intrigued me the most about vampires as a teen, as a kid, before I even got into the whole culty thing, was the immortality. And I used to think that was a great thing. Like that would be just the best thing ever to have. And being a vampire is the best way to do it, because as a zombie, you're falling apart. You know, you're literally decomposing in front of everybody. Vampires, you know, for however they do it, and I'd seen enough interpretations over the years to know there were different ways or means or variations on the theme, but however it was done, they got to live forever in a body that looked awesome.
Mm.
You know, however that was done. So
Right.
even for me, that was one of the original appeals of vampires, again, in our modern times. So I agree.
Yeah.
I get that point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's you know, I think that's kind of how it's evolved and how it speaks to us now. And, you know, in the future, in another 100 years, 200 years, what's going to resonate with the culture then and the audiences then? Who's to say? Who knows how the vampire will continue to change and adapt itself to kind of stay, you know, stick around and you know, kind of haunt the place.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, AP, listen, man, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to be part of my show and converse with me here about this. I have found your information wonderful and enlightening and giving me more about something I absolutely love, which I have never, ever, ever had an opportunity to share with my audience. So, so thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, it's a good time. And I'm going to remind everybody out there, the book is Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, and it was released on Schiffer Publishing this past October. So where can they get it?
Sure. So you can get it from sort of all the kind of main online booksellers, you know, Amazon, barnesandnoble.com.
Right.
I think like Target.com has it. You can go to like your local bookstore and ask if they can get it for you. I think they should be able to get it for you. Last time I checked, I think it was in stock in some Barnes and Noble's locations in like New York and LA areas. So kind of, you know, wherever you get your books, check for it. And if they don't have it, ask.
Excellent. Wherever fine books are sold.
Wherever fine books are sold.
All right. And then they can find you on your website, locationsoflore.com, link below in the show notes and description to this video. And they can find you on Twitter at AP Sylvia Writes with a W. AP Sylvia Writes. So check them out on Twitter. And check out that book. I think you guys will be pretty happy with it if it's covering even, you know, the kind of stuff we've been talking about today, because this has been interesting.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, folks. Any comments, of course, go ahead and leave them in the comments section. And I am interested in your feedback on this episode. Actually, I will be looking because I'm curious if forays of this kind are of any real interest to my audience. I certainly hope they are, because I would love to do more dives into this kind of stuff. Just because I love talking about the fantasy and horror stuff when I get opportunities to, which is hardly ever, given the nature of most of what I talk about. Kind of its own horror show with cults. But anyway, if you are finding this show entertaining, informative, and educational, and I hope you are, then please consider signing up with me on Patreon. Link below and in the show notes at sensiblyspeaking.com. This is a fan-funded show, and you guys are keeping me afloat here and allowing me to continue making this content for you and doing the best job I know how to do so. So thank you very much for your viewership and your support, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.